Hey everybody, so I'm back to do another Iron Man review, and this time we're talking about more Kurt Busiek Iron Man. We're on to issues 11 through 17. Now there's a lot to cover here, there's a lot that gets done. In the middle of this omnibus, you do have a Iron Man Captain America annual written by Roger Stern, Mark Waid, and Kurt Busiek, I think. And there's some greater consequences to what happens there. It's interesting how much Iron Man and Captain America have been compared and contrasted well before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so to see a lot of their debates in comics line up with things that we would get much later in film, and believing it on film to be a happy accident as opposed to being inherently in the comics, it's an interesting experience going back and reading some of that stuff. But I won't really talk about that. There's a Fantastic Four issue here that I won't completely talk about. This is more Iron Man focused. So at the end of the last set of issues, we talked about Revenge of the Mandarin. And Revenge of the Mandarin was only 2 issues, but it spanned some pretty lengthy consequences throughout Busiek's book as a whole. There's actually quite a bit of stuff that Revenge of the Mandarin actually left hanging, that Iron Man is still dealing with throughout this book. And so we'll talk about some of that as this goes forward. Basically what we have here is, starting with issue 11, is issue 11, is that Tony, after that fight, and after what happened with Captain America, has been really badly hurt. And it started in the issues before Revenge of the Mandarin, where Tony was just beaten to an inch of his life by the Death Squad, and then he decided to put the armor on right away and go fight the Mandarin, and then he just kept getting hurt and kept prolonging that damage. And here he's moving into his new house, which, by the way, is another thing we do with Iron Man. For some reason, he always moves into a new house for most of the runs that I've read. So he does that. We go through the new house, and then we go through and we get to Jane Foster and Hank Pym that tell us about Tony's damage. Now, the reveal is going to come a little bit later, so we'll talk about that as we get there. But basically, Tony has been pretty brutally hurt, and he's not recovering as quickly as he should be. And so he's under strict orders to not put on the armor and to not go out and to not really do anything. And obviously, because this is a superhero comic, we know that this guy is not going to listen. And so despite that warning, he will eventually decide to fight anyway. In the middle of this, we realize that Tony has moved to Seattle as opposed to living in New York City, and conveniently, so has Carol Danvers. She's also moved to Seattle. She's got a book deal, and she's just going to sit there and be a writer, and she actually runs into Tony in the middle of one of her meetings, and they have kind of a combative altercation, more of just Carol Danvers being paranoid and thinking Tony's there to check up on her when he's really not. And in the middle of this, we also get that Madame Mask, a character from the classic Iron Man stories, who used to be Iron Man's girlfriend and all that, has been killed and her body's been discovered, and all of this will build into later things. And so, setting up all that important plot stuff, we also get the news that a guy in a War Machine armor is attacking a company that Stark Solutions is about to consult with. And this War Machine is taking the original armor taking the original armor design, but not the actual original armor. He's being sent by a Banetronics firm that is basically wanting Tony to consult with them, and so they're trying to destroy everyone on the list ahead of them. And it's kind of a hilariously bad logic, especially when the person calls Tony immediately after this plan starts and says, "So it's a shame about that company that was ahead of us on the list. So you want to work with us now?" And it's really obvious, and Tony figures out immediately that these are the people that sent War Machine to attack this other firm. Now the thing about War Machine is War Machine was the thing that got started in Len Kaminsky's run, and then there was stuff that happened in between the Heroes Are Born stuff and the stuff after Kaminsky by, I forget what the writer's name is off the top of my head, but there's all this stuff with young Tony and War Machine and such, and they recap all of War Machine's history and losing the armor several times, and Brody's just having his own company now and not being War Machine, and so having War Machine here in this point in time is kind of a surprise, and Tony, being in not great condition, decides to fight War Machine, and pretty swiftly gets his ass kicked. It's kind of fun to watch. It's a pretty brutal fight, in all honesty, and Tony is just not in it. And so Carol Danvers shows up to help, and they don't really work together well, but Tony keeps trying. He keeps trying to save civilians and such. And the fight just gets worse and worse and worse. And by the end of it, Tony decides to go back to his house and grab a negator pack from Armor Wars. And he attaches the negator pack onto War Machine, and it doesn't negate any of War Machine's technology, thus proving that this armor was not using Stark tech, despite looking exactly like the original War Machine costume. And so after both Carol Danvers and Iron Man defeated, this War Machine flies off and his job's been accomplished. But in the middle of the fight, both Carol Danvers and Tony Stark get like a nice mutual understanding for each other, and she apologizes for the way she's been behaving, and she kind of realizes that finally now that she has a problem. And she's going to try and work on that, and we'll deal with more with Carol Danvers stuff later when we get to issue 18. So after that, we go back to Tony Stark, and we find out that the reason he hasn't been healing and the reason he keeps getting damaged is that it's essentially the same effect as people that live next to power lines. You realize that you have bad health effects, bad health consequences when you live too close to power lines because of the electrical fields. And what we find out is because Tony's been spending most of his life inside the armor, it's like he's been living inside of a power line for most of his life, and so his body has been almost irreversibly damaged by this, and so he can't put on the armor or it might kill him at this point. And so the Renaissance armor basically gets scrapped at this point. We see him put on the armor one more time later, but it's more of a reluctant thing, and we see the effects happen in more full force there. We see Tony get to a point where he puts on the armor and he's already starting to feel dizzy. But so Tony's armor addiction starts to manifest even more literally now, because there's a really great panel in the middle of this where Tony wants to go out and figure out what's going on, and he's like all bandaged up and hurt, and he tries to put the armor on. He can only get like halfway. He can only get it on like halfway before he collapses, and there's just this beaten, kind of desperate, addicted Tony laying on the floor with parts of his armor kind of grasping for it, and you finally get inside his head a little bit and see the addiction for what it is. And it's a great panel. It's a really depressing panel. And so from this point, Tony has to figure out a way to keep going without the armor, or at least find a way to fix the armor, because it's got all these electrical fields that it generates, and he needs a way to shield himself from that as he's using it. And so, while all that's going on, Jane Foster sends him to a clinic to stay for a few months and hopefully get better. And that becomes issue 13, and that's one big story with the controller and a girl that we see from issues 5 and 6 who becomes Tony Stark's girlfriend for a little while. And all that stuff's really interesting. We get, again, more inside Tony Stark's head and see more of his personality in coming up with the idea of Iron Man, and him trying to be a person that fixes everyone's problems constantly, and being sort of addicted to that, kind of never being satisfied with what he's able to give, always trying to give more, and always cleaning up his own messes because of that. And we see with his new girlfriend Rumiko from the previous issues that she's kind of the opposite, and that she's kind of more about being reactionary and kind of being more about breaking away from any and all obligation. But there's like a nice middle ground between the two that can't necessarily come to fruition because of Iron Man and because Tony's sort of addiction to work in general, and this idea that he's never at home unless he's doing 10 things at once, which is sort of a fun chemistry, and I wish we got more with her down the line, but we never really do. The controller issues are fine. The controller's a character that's really small for the most part of Marvel history, and then here he shows up. He's got this big master plan. It's kind of an interesting idea of using his powers at the spa to make people other people's slaves, and so he basically says, okay, how much would you pay for your agenda to be implanted into this person's mind? And that's kind of cool. It's an interesting plan. They don't really do a lot with it. It's just kind of set up. It's just a generic villain plot at that point. Then we go on to a crossover with the Fantastic Four, and the only reason worth mentioning this is that we get the alternate armor that Tony wears since the Renaissance armor is not working for him anymore. And that alternate armor is this thing that's just kind of called the... when I go by armor names, I don't usually go by the way it's listed in the books because they don't usually give us too many names, but I go by something, a book called the Iron Manual. And the Iron Manual lists this particular armor as the experiment or the test armor. And it's only used 2 times. It's only used here in this Fantastic Four issue and then in the connecting Iron Man issue. It's just a much bulkier design. It's kind of just like, what if Hulkbuster attachments were thrown on top of the Renaissance armor? And it doesn't look very good, I don't think. But that story ultimately doesn't matter much to what we're talking about here, aside from introducing that armor. And then we go back into the main Iron Man story, and he finally gets his new armor, which is called the Safe Armor. And this one is not small enough to fit inside of a briefcase because it's got more shielding on it to protect him from the electrical fields he generates. And the Safe Armor just gets stored in his trunk. It kind of collapses into this almost pod-like thing. Picture the thing from Avengers at the end of the film when Tony gets thrown out the window and he activates his armor and there's like a little rocket ship that flies out the window and armor's on top of him. That's kind of what the Renaissance, that's kind of what the Safe Armor is like, except the pod itself is a little bit smaller so it can fit inside of a trunk. It's actually not a bad design. He uses it to fight Nitro, and it's actually a fairly quick battle because he's able to figure out his weakness pretty quickly. And we get more about the collateral damage. We get more about what is Iron Man's effect on people, because Tony's here in Seattle and he's trying to help people and he's trying to build like centers for children and hospitals and do more for the Maria Stark Foundation and all that. And then people don't immediately trust him. People think that Tony's showing up and trying to run their lives, and he's not. And it's more about just him not being able to present himself as being genuinely wanting to help people. And so Happy Hogan's able to convey that message for him more, and Happy, who's been a character throughout most of this run feeling kind of inadequate, finally finds his place here as sort of the perfect middleman, sort of the perfect one of the people kind of guys, that he's just so average, that he's just so run-of-the-mill, that he's always been upset about the fact that there's nothing spectacular about him, and that's kind of what he becomes. He becomes the ordinary man's voice, and he uses that to figure out what people need, to figure out what people want Tony Stark to do, to figure out problems that someone like Tony would not necessarily see, and then help solve them. And Tony uses that by being the chief, by making him the chief liaison from the Maria Stark Foundation to the community. And so it's kind of a nice way to give that character some confidence back, some power back, as opposed to just being Tony Stark's driver or bodyguard. And so that's fun. And in the middle of this, we also get some stuff with Tony and Pepper. There's a couple of moments here where it's almost like Busiek's trying to write these two together, and I really resist the Tony and Pepper relationship because we've gotten hundreds of issues at this point where they're not a thing, and I was never a big fan of divorcing Pepper and Happy in the first place, and so doing more with Pepper and Tony and moving Happy out, I don't really like. I feel like we're kind of throwing Pepper under the bus and not giving her her own kind of independent character streak. I don't like that we just kind of use her as a character for mostly relationships. I kind of wish she could just come into her own more, and I wish Busiek would write her that way a bit more. I feel like the divorce was a bad idea. And we never really get inside either Happy or Pepper's head enough to make us justify their antagonism towards each other, or Tony's attraction to her, or her attraction to Tony, or any of that stuff. But that all happens. It's all kind of interesting for the most part, except for the Pepper stuff. And then we get the return of Fang Foom, which basically you see a green dragon statue that's talking to this kid, and then eventually convinces the kid to steal the statue, and then he uses the kid's body to transform himself back into Fang Foom. And Tony has a battle with him, and it lasts for about 2 issues, and it's pretty cool. It's a pretty extensive fight, and we get to see the Safe Armor in action, and I have a little thing I want to say about that in a minute. But Fang Foom's a lot like Revenge of the Mandarin, where Busiek's explanation for how Fang Foom comes back after his last story is basically that Fang Foom comes back after his last story. And I guess that's just Busiek kind of knowing comic book logic and knowing nothing stays dead. At the same time, the last time we saw Fin Fang Foom was like Iron Man, I want to say 275 or 276. It was during the Dragon Seed Saga. It was during John Byrne's run when Tony used his armor and the Mandarin Rings to destroy all the dragons. And so it's been a good while since that character's been around, and I feel like we need more of an explanation and why he needs to merge onto a kid's body and all of that. We need a better explanation for why Mandarin showed back up after Hands of the Mandarin, but I kind of let that go just because Mandarin's one of those characters that's always coming back and being reinvented. With Fin Fang Foom, it was very clearly invented for a story, died within a story, and now he's back, and I wish we understood that more. The metaphor of the knight slaying the dragon, the thing that Iron Man 3 takes, the thing with Tony in the armor, and the dragon being kind of the classic hero mythology is played up here again, of Tony trying to fix everyone's problems, but also trying to build his own sort of sense of altruism. And that's fun and that's interesting, and there's complexity thrown in because it's just this kid that's being used by Fin Fang Foom, and it's that kid's sort of mental power over Fin Fang Foom in his body that helps Tony take the dragon out at the end of the day, which is all fun and interesting. Now here's the problem. Here's the thing that is classic Iron Man comic book issue, which is back when we had the Dragon Seed Saga, Iron Man was using, I want to say he was using his first unit of the telepresence armor. Because he's using telepresence from the end of Byrne's run up to Kaminsky's run. And we have oversized red and gold that shows up in Armor Wars and the second Michelini Layton run. And so oversized red and gold actually carries through Byrne's run, but because Tony gets paralyzed through that, the telepresence armor is used with the exact same design, but to fit Tony's body, despite him not having the use of his legs. So Tony's armor has upgraded several folds since then. We've gone from telepresence we've gone from oversized red and gold to telepresence to modular armor to the really dumb-looking crossing armor and young Tony armor, and then the later Heroes Reborn armor, and then the Renaissance armor, and then the test armor, and here we're at the safe armor. There is like half a dozen sets of armor between Dragon Seed Saga and this story. And in that story, I could buy, in the Dragon Seed Saga, that Tony was not able to take out Fin Fang Foom by himself because he needed Mandarin's help. But his armor technology has improved several folds since then. So fighting Fin Fang Foom by himself should not be difficult. And it's the thing with Nitro, where Tony's able to take out Nitro pretty quickly because his armor's improved, but it's like Iron Man's armor improves, and we always through that same scale improve everyone else just by default. Like, no matter how much we improve Tony's armor, standard armor Tony's never going to be able to go toe-to-toe against Thor or Hulk without a Hulk or Thor Buster. And that shouldn't happen if his armor keeps upgrading. If his armor's upgraded as much as it has between Dragon Seed Saga and this story, Fin Fang Foom should not be a challenge to his current safe armor. And yet he is, and that's just a thing with Iron Man armor technology that never quite changes, and it's always kind of a problem. Back in the days of classic red and gold, I could buy him having to go toe-to-toe with Namor. By the time you get to not even modular, by the time you get to oversized red and gold, Namor shouldn't be a challenge to him anymore, and yet he constantly is. Iron Man is a character that has to constantly improve, and we never really feel the impact of that technological improvement because we have to make every fight difficult for whatever reason. So that element of the Fin Fang Foom fight I don't really like. The other thing to mention is that Rhodey knows who's in the War Machine armor, and he's going around tracking that guy down. So there's several open plot threads at this point that I just want to recap as we're talking about this run. So we know that all these people that have attacked Tony, half of them were for the Mandarin, and that's stopped. Although we know the Mandarin should come back at some point because the Mandarin taunted Tony as much as that he would. We know that the other half of people, including Nitro, are being sent by someone else. We know Banetronics used War Machine to try and get Stark Solutions to work with them, and the guy that was in the War Machine armor is someone connected to Rhodey's past back when he was a mercenary that Rhodey's going to check out. We know that Happy Hogan is in charge of this new sector of the Maria Stark Foundation, being the liaison between the community and the Foundation, and he's kind of got a new girlfriend, more of like a new love interest in the middle of that. We know that Tony and Pepper have sort of a weird flirt thing going on. Just a couple of panels here and there that gives us this idea that they might like each other. We know that's going on. We know that... I'm trying to think what else we have in this set of issues. We know Tony's got his new safe armor that he's been using for a while. We know Tony moved to Seattle. We know that Madame Mask has died and someone's killed her, and Tony's got to figure out who. And then finally we know Carol Danvers is still an alcoholic, and we're going to deal with more of that. So 17 issues into this run, and we still have more questions than we have answers. And I kind of appreciate that. Busiek leaves with issue 25, so we're kind of wrapping things up here, but then Joe Quesada comes in and does 26 through 36, and so we'll talk about that as well. This is a good wave of issues. This is more of the setup area. There isn't a lot of interesting thematic stuff to talk about, as much as there was between issues 1 through 10, because this is more of just plot threads are moving all over the place, and they're all about to converge at some point. So this is still a good read. This is, again, something that you're just going to have to stick through. I feel like I needed to do the review of 11 through 17, because if I did 11 through 25 and just talk about the conclusion of all these plot threads, there would just be way too much to address in that one particular video. And so I'm using this as more like a recap of everything that's going on in Busiek's run. So yeah, this is still good. This is still interesting. Pepper Potts is still kind of my only complaint right now. But I like everything that's going on right now. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said, whether there's anything I missed talking about within this set of issues, because there's just a lot to discuss. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.